Conference. I love it that they saved the best for last. I'm going to be talking about choosing a JavaScript framework. My name is Jennifer Bland. I'm a senior software developer over at Stanley Black & Decker. Prior to that, I worked literally across the street at CNN. And it's good to see a lot of the former CNN people that I used to work with here today. Also, shout out to all the people from Women in Code who are here on the front row. Love having you here today. If you would like to get in touch with me down the road, here's how you can contact me. This gives you my website, which is appropriately jenniferbland.com. I will have this as my last slide, so if you don't get a picture of it now, just wait till the very end. My last slide, I'll leave it up so that you can take a picture of it. My Twitter account is RatRaceGrad, as well as my GitHub account. If you're on LinkedIn, RatRaceGrad is also my LinkedIn account. And then it also has my YouTube channel on there. I have quite a few training videos, and I'll talk about that at the very end of my presentation. Now, to give you a little bit of information about myself, at a lot of my talks, I love to do this, 3 truths and 1 lie. Here are four facts. 3 of these are true, 1 is not. And I'm gonna let you stew on this while my presentation is going on, and at the very end of my presentation, I'll let you guess which one of these 4 is not true. 3 of these are true about myself, 1 isn't. And I decided to go British royalty for the 4 facts for you to choose from today. The first one, I asked Prince Charles for his autograph at a Georgia football game. I attended Prince Philip's birthday party at Edinburgh Castle in Edinburgh, Scotland. I attended Easter Mass at Windsor Castle with Queen Elizabeth. I attended St. John's College at Oxford University with Prince Andrew, who was the 2nd son of the Queen. So, give you a chance to think about that, and at the very end, I'll give you a chance to guess which one of those is not true. For my presentation, I'm going to be walking through a very simple to-do application that's been created in Angular, one that's been created in React, and one that's been created in Vue. And the reason why is I want to show you the comparison between those 3 so that you can decide the pros and cons of all 3 and which one to use. The code for all 3 are on my GitHub account that I posted up on a slide previously. I'll have my link to my GitHub account at the very end so that you can actually get that. When you look at the GitHub repo, it's very simple in its design. It has 3 folders, appropriately named Angular, React, and Vue, and the code for each is inside it. And just follow the Readme file in each folder, and it will show you how to get the application up and running on each one of those. All right, so what I want to do now is actually go through and demo the applications that we're going to be talking about. So I'm going to stop this. All right, so now you can see what we have on here. This is my GitHub repo. And if I bring up a browser, here is the Angular to-do app. I've made it with the red background. Here is the React version with the black and blue colors, and then the blue and green of the Vue application that we're going to be doing. So as you look at them, they pretty much have the exact same layout, the exact same look and feel, but what you use to actually create them between the 3 are different, and that's what we're going to be talking about for the presentation. So let me jump back over here. All right, so if I did that correctly, y'all should be seeing my slides. Perfect. All right, so in this, if you wanted to know what I'm going to be talking about and what, more importantly, I will not be covering in this presentation, is I will not tell you exactly which one of the 3 that you should be using. I will tell you the pros and cons of each. I will show you how to do the exact same functionality in all three so that you can see them and you can compare and contrast them. And then you can take that information back into your environment, and if you have to decide on which framework to use, then you can look at these pros and cons and use that to make an informed decision for yourself so that you're using the correct framework within your environment. But what I will cover is hopefully a very neutral, non-biased comparison between the three applications for you to be able to use. And before we get going, I want to cover two basically terminology phrases that I'm going to be using in my presentation. If you're not familiar with the JavaScript frameworks, you're going to be lost as what I'm talking if you're not understanding these two phrases. And the very first one is what's called an MVC pattern or an architecture. And it's normally called MVC, which is short for model, view, and controller. And it's a way of defining how your data is structured in a very large application. On here you'll see an image that basically shows how data flows through in a traditional MVC or a model view controller type application. You as the end user is a circle at the bottom of the screen. What you'll do is you actually will interact with something that you're looking at in a browser, and then once you interact with it, the C part of the MVC, the controller, picks that data up, maybe manipulates it or somehow, and sends it to usually what's the back end into the model. Model is usually your database. It's where your data is stored. Once it's finished, saving the database, maybe retrieving certain data, that information is then passed on to the view. So now you've done a complete round trip on here, and then that data is displayed to you again in the browser. So when I talk about the MVC framework, this is what I'm talking about. The other terminology that you need to know is what's the difference between a framework and a library? Because we're going to be talking about Angular, React, and Vue. Some of them are frameworks, some of them are libraries. So they are different. So you're not really comparing apples to apples because of that difference. So if you want to know, a framework kind of is like what you think of what that means in terms of a framework. It basically defines the entire application design. It structures everything around what you're going to be doing within your application, and everything that your code uses is dependent on what that framework supports and how you actually implement the code within that framework. A framework is what's called, it's very opinionated because it defines how things are done, so you have to follow its framework and how things are being used. A library, on the other hand, allows you to create functions that are actually called by the parent code. It doesn't have the limitations that a framework has. And because of that, it's a lot more freeform. You can do things more directly and have access to it. Because of that, it's one of the negativities of a traditional framework is that you have that liberty to do things in a different way on there. So the first one that I'm going to talk about of the three is Angular, and I'm just going to do these in alphabetical order so we can talk about it. To give you a high-level overview of Angular, because I'm not going to teach you how to program in Angular, React, or Vue, but in a high-level view, Angular was released in October of 2010. That's kind of it's kind of the oldest one of the three that we're going to be talking about, and it was originally released, it was called Angular, now it's called Angular.js, Angular 1. The people that created Angular basically in May of 2016 introduced the version 2 of Angular, which is their new and improved version of Angular. That version of Angular was a complete rewrite of the original version of Angular. So when you look at Angular, you have to realize that you're looking at versions Angular 2 versus Angular.js. So the original version of Angular is now called Angular.js. Angular 2 and up now has adopted the name Angular. It's basically maintained and supported by Google. So you're being supported by a major company that's out there in the industry. They have stated a process that they are going to do updates to Angular twice a year. So approximately every May timeframe of every year and every October of every year, they are going to do an update to Angular. So you will get new versions released, twice a year. Earlier I talked about terminology. Angular is a framework. It's very opinionated. You actually have to control what you can do and how you can do it, within the application itself. Some of the things of Angular is, and for its programming languages, it uses Typescript. You don't have to use Typescript with Angular. You probably don't want to, but you can use straight JavaScript if you want. But most everything is being done in Angular development is being done in TypeScript. Angular by itself provides built-in support for mobile application development. What that means is that you can write one code base using NativeScript, which is built into Angular, and then be able to deploy that exact same code base both on an iOS platform as well as an Android platform, and then also have that same code base used for the web. So if you're needing to be able to support all three, iOS, Android, and web, that's a concern that you might want to look at. The reason that Angular started to use TypeScript is, how many of you use JavaScript today? JavaScript, as you know, is what's called a loosely typed language. So you can create a variable, for example, a variable called name, and you can assign it Jennifer to that variable. So the variable name has a string that's assigned to it. Later on in your code, you can actually assign a number to that same variable. So you can assign 55 to that variable. So now, instead of having a string value, it has a number value. And JavaScript allows you to do that because it's a loosely typed language. If you've used any other major languages that are out there, they are not loosely typed. That would have generated an error message if you converted something that was a string and then you now try to assign a number to it. What TypeScript does is a superset of JavaScript that provides a static type language on top of JavaScript, so that if you try to convert that name from a string to a number, it's going to give you an error message. So that's why Angular uses TypeScript. Some of the major terminologies that you would use when you start learning Angular are, it's a component-based architecture. And what that means is that it allows you to create subsets of your code and take all these subsets together and use that to create your finished application. The feature that Angular introduced when it first came out in 2010 was a thing called two-way data binding. What that means is that in the model view controller that we talked about earlier, is if a user, let's say, enters a form and you have a website where you're looking at airline flight schedules, and they put in what city they're flying out to and what city they want to fly to and a date, and then they submit. Then that goes to the back end. The back end looks at the data, gets all the information, finds all the flights for that between those two cities on that particular day, and sends it back to the front end, and that information is displayed to the user. With two-way data binding, if the user changes something, it gets updated in the model on the back end. If the model gets changed, it will automatically update the view for what the user sees. So it's two ways in the way the information is flowing. The next one is called Dependency Injection. As I mentioned earlier, Angular is a component-based language, so you use a lot of components together to create an application. Dependency injection is the way that you get the functionality from one component and be able to pass it into another component. So that functionality is built into Angular. And the other thing that Angular uses in order to communicate between components are a terminology called services and directives. And services and directives give that functionality, so you might have a central suite of functions that are being used across multiple components. All of those components can access that service and have access to that list of functionality that's available to it. The other thing that Angular provides is their Angular CLI. And the CLI is that you would install it globally on your machine, and then from your command line, you can just type in a very simple command, and you can create the scaffolding for a very basic Angular application. You can do a lot more functionality with it, with the Angular CLI. You can use it to create components. You can use it to create services and directives. You can use it to build out applications. You can use it to run tests. It provides a wealth of functionality to you in the CLI. Now that I've given you an overview of what the key things that are used within Angular, I want to give you some of the pros and cons, at least from my perspective, of Angular. And I'll start with the pros. The first one is it's a component-based architecture. If you're not doing development today where you're using components, you're just doing it wrong. Because it allows you to do things quickly and easily, it allows you to test things easier, it allows you to manage things a lot easier, and it's also friendlier when it comes to doing unit testing because everything is contained in there. The other one is it's maintainability. Because a component contains the HTML, the CSS, and the JavaScript functionality behind that component, all within the component, it's easier to maintain it and be able to utilize it. So one of the things is we get over and I start looking and I'll show you the code between them. I'll show you where you can easily drop in and replace one component for another component and it not interrupt the entire application as you're going through that. In terms of another thing that's a pro for it is the Typescript, as I mentioned earlier, that allows you to have a static type language on top of everything on JavaScript. It's platform agnostic, meaning, as I mentioned earlier, you can write an Angular app for the web, you can write it for an iOS environment, you can write it for an Android environment, or you can write it for all three and be able to use it on that. The other one is because it's supported and maintained by Google, you have long-term support or LTS for Angular. So you don't have to worry about using it and then this going out of, technically out of business or not being used as much, by this time next year. The other thing is because it's a framework, it provides all three parts of the MVC platform that I talked about earlier. Of the three, it's the only one that provides that functionality to you. So if you want to have an MVC environment with the other two, you're going to have to use some other product to give you that whole MVC platform available to you. And as I mentioned earlier, you have the Angular CLI. Of the three, all three have a CLI, but the Angular CLI is clearly superior than the other two. Now, let's look at the negatives that we have with Angular. There's a lot of animosity in the community toward Google and Angular because of the way they handle things. As I mentioned earlier, it was originally introduced in 2010. In 2015, they introduced Angular 2. When they did that, it was a complete rewrite. You couldn't just upgrade from Angular 1 to Angular 2. You kind of had to completely rewrite your code base in order to use that. And of course, a lot of people were kind of frustrated. They're like, well, we spent all this time and this money to build this. Now I'm going to have to rewrite it. And they're like, this sucks. You know, basically is what a lot of people thought. And I agree with them, that is true. And then after that, you know, transition period that people had of having to rewrite their code, they announced that they were going to come out with new releases every 6 months. And people were like, oh no, that means you're going to have to rewrite my code every 6 months. And actually, no, that's not true. But going from 1 to 2 was a complete and major rewrite. But if you went from like version 2 to version 4, it's not a major rewrite. You know, there's some new features, maybe a couple of changes that you have to make, but moving from one version to the next version going forward isn't going to require a complete rewrite of the code. To give you an example of who uses Angular, of course Google, because they created it, and if you listen to the Google, team members that create Angular, they talk about they use it for every application internally within Google itself. Forbes magazine uses it, so what we're talking about is major companies that are using it. Weather.com, which gets a huge amount of hits, to their website. Healthcare.gov, PayPal, Nike, HBO, General Motors, and Sony. Mainly what you want to take away from this slide is that it's companies that have very large-scale applications. So it tells you that Angular is able to scale up and hold and support applications that are getting millions of hits on a regular basis, and it needs to be able to support that. So now what we're going to do is we're going to do a demonstration, and let me. I'm going to, let me change my, so you should be able to see my browser. This is the sample code that I have out on my GitHub repo. And looking at the to-do app from the Angular standpoint, the first thing that you want to look at is the Readme file that's in there. And it tells you basically how you can go about installing it, the commands for being able to get it running, how to build it, and so forth. When you look at what's coming into it from the CLI, I just basically said ng new and gave it a name, and it created the framework for me to use. And then I added a couple of components that I have in there. One of the distinctions between Angular versus React and Vue when you're using their CLI is that Angular provides tests or frameworks for tests. The other two don't. So that's one of the things you have to also consider that you have in there. So you can see in here that it has Karma loaded for me. It has Protractor for the end-to-end tests. It has a folder with sample tests that are in here that I can use. And then in here we have our source folder, very common folder convention that you have in here. And what we have is you have your index.html, and when we look at this, it's a very simple index.html. You've got your head, your body. Your body has one element that's in there. You have an app root that's available to you. And when you come over here in there, you look at your app component. This is the root component of your application that you're going to be using. When you define a component in Angular, the way that it's structured is you have to do the imports to pull in Angular so that you can have access to it. But in here, these three, actually technically 4 lines, but the providers is one that you normally don't see. But a component by default usually has 3 things in it. You have the selector, which is the element selector. You saw in my index.html, you had an element that was called app-root. This is where it's going to get that name from. That's where the selector name is. The template URL is the HTML that is going to be displaying the application itself, and then you have your CSS file that's available to you. And basically, when you have multiple components, best practices are that these components are broken out into their own environment. So if I look at my app component.html, it has a very simple H1 for my title. It has another component that it's displaying, and then it has another component below it. And the way that that looks like is if I come over here and I look at it, here's my H1. This list of all of the items in the to-do, that's the very first component that you were looking at. And then this bottom part is the form component where you have the input and the add button to be able to share that information between them. So if I want to go down and start looking at, for example, the to-do list, you can use the CLI to create a component, and what it's going to do is automatically create the folder for you. It's going to create a CSS file, an HTML file, a spec file which is used for test, which is one of the distinctions that Angular provides that the other two do not. And then you actually have your component itself, and then you come in here, and this component says I'm using the HTML file, the CSS. It fills in all this information for you by creating it from the command line. And then it actually registers it in the app component, which was the first thing that we looked at. And if you look at the HTML that's in here, it's using a little bit of Bootstrap in here to be able to provide the information that's available to us. And then you see it, I'm calling another component within this. And each one of the items that are listed in the to-do, each one has their own list item. So that list item basically is going to give me, I'll come over here and show you, each one of these three is a list item component. And that list item is going to give me a check mark. It's going to give me the title of the to-do, and then it's going to put this X, which is a button, and it's going to float it over to the right so it lines up correctly, so that if I click on this button on the checkbox, which it will actually mark this as done, and when it gets marked done, it calls the function, and that function will put the strike through it so that you have it available. If I clicked on the X, it will actually delete that item from the to-do. So here you see all of this information that's available to you, and in our root, we have a to-do data service. So I talked about some of the functionalities and features in Angular is that you have directives and services. So all of the functionality of adding a to-do, deleting a to-do, marking it as complete or incomplete if you want to go the other way, all that functionality is contained here in this service so I have access to it. Because it's a framework, it's very opinionated in how things are done, so that when you look at the code, you're going to have a little bit of a learning curve in being able to use it. Of the three, Angular is going to be the hardest one for you to go through and actually to learn. So let's go back. So the next one that I'm going to talk about is React. And information about React, it was released in March 2013. So of the three, Angular is the oldest, React is the next oldest. New versions are updated annually and it's maintained by Facebook. Unlike Angular, it is a library. It is not a framework. So of the Mvc Pattern, it provides only the Vue capabilities available to you. It's agnostic to your data letter, so you can use whatever you want for the model part of your MVC application, because all it wants to worry about is the view. So you can use whatever it is that you want to use. The thing that makes React unique is it uses something that's called a virtual DOM. If you've ever done development on the front end using HTML and manipulating the DOM, you know that the slowest part of that process is updating the DOM itself. It takes a long time for the browsers to rebuild the DOM in your browser. So what React did was they went out and they used what's called a shadow DOM, or a virtual DOM that they use, and they update everything that needs to be done in the shadow DOM. Then once they've updated it, they do basically a diff between the DOM itself and that virtual DOM, and anything that's changed, it only updates that in the DOM itself. So you're not redoing the whole page like Angular does, is it will refresh the whole page. Even if the only thing you have to update is one word, they refresh the whole page. With React, it's going to update just that part that has changed. The other thing that's different about React is that it uses JSX. Angular uses Typescript, React uses JSX. If you've ever done JavaScript development, pretty much what you're used to doing is that you separated out your UI, your HTML and CSS code from your JavaScript code. So you always had separate files between them. You wanted to have that separation from them. What React does is it says, well, maybe that wasn't a good idea after all. Let's combine them together into the same file. So that's what JSX does, is it provides the ability to have the JavaScript functionality and the UI display all together within one file. So as you're learning React, one of the things that is hard to learn when you first start off is that you're basically creating HTML and CSS within JavaScript. So that's one of the challenges in learning React. In terms of the functionality that you have within React, it's a component-based architecture just like Angular. The two main things that you will learn terminology-wise with React is that you have props and states. Props is just a shorthand for properties. It's data that's passed into a component. State is basically, where you can maintain state within an application, and then it gets changed over the lifetime of your application itself. Some of the pros and cons of React is that it has what's called a zero configuration. You can use the React CLI to scaffold out an application for you to use. Once it's done that, there are no configuration files. You don't have to worry about configuring all the things for a build setup, how to run it and everything else like that. All of that is done for you. There's nothing that you can do to go in and change. You can't tweak it and try to improve it. It's there for you. It's a much more better improvement over what you have with Angular itself. The virtual DOM, as I talked about earlier, makes it faster in rendering data to people on the front end. And since React only deals with the view part, that's what they want to emphasize in their improvements. And it uses components, and it provides one-way data binding. Unlike Angular, as I mentioned, that does the two-way data binding, you have one-way data binding with React. And the reason why is because it's only the view part of that MVC framework available to you. So all it wants to do is worry about basically sending data back out, to the back end. Some of the cons. When you use the React CLI, which is Create React App, there doesn't provide testing, for you. So if you're going to create a new component and whatnot, it doesn't scaffold out testing, work for you to be able to use. If you want to be able to create the entire MVC functionality with React, you're going to have to use React with something else. And usually that something else is more than one product. With Angular, you pretty much can get by with everything that you need out of the box. If you want to provide the exact same functionality, using React that you get out of the box with Angular, you're going to basically have to start using it with things like React and Redux and Flux and React Native and other things to be able to give you that same functionality. So even though you're using React, it does have a shorter learning curve than does Angular, but you also are going to have to be learning other products in order to be able to use it. If you want to do the mobile functionality that's built into Angular, you're going to have to use React Native. If you know how to use React, you pretty much will, it'll be an easy transition over to using React Native. In terms of documentation, the documentation is adequate. It's not as verbose or as have as many examples as you would with the Angular documentation. And the other thing is it doesn't use templates. Companies that use React, just like Angular, it's a large number of big companies that are using this. So that tells you that you can use it from a very simple single-page application all the way up to a mission-critical application by companies. So, of course, Facebook uses it, but Airbnb, Uber, Netflix, Twitter, you can see the rest of this list of companies that actually use it. So let's swap over here. So we looked at Angular. So let me close this down. And let's look at the exact same functionality that we have within React. So this was an application that was created with the Create React app. It uses, it has a public folder for you to put basic information that's going to be accessed on the front end. It uses the source folder just like Angular does. And then in there, you end up having your app.js. This has all of the major functionality that you have in there. It uses a different look and feel than what you were looking on Angular. You import in all the components that you're going to be using. You also have to import in React so that you have access to it. In here, you have your constructor, where you have your props, because remember the two things that you learn when using React are props and state. And you have all the functionality that you use to add an item, remove an item, or to mark it is put in here. So this is the way JSX kind of works, is that you have your traditional import. So if you've done a lot of JavaScript development, this is not anything that's not new to you. You have your class with your constructor method. You have your methods that are built into the class itself. And then here at the very bottom, this part is what's unique about JSX. As I mentioned, one of the cons about React is that it doesn't use templates. So therefore, your information that you're displaying out is basically you building your HTML within this JavaScript file, which is one of the things is, you know, for people that are going through and using it, it's something that's unique and unusual to see for the very first time. And then each of my components that I have out here, before in Angular, you had an HTML file, you had a CSS file, and you had your Typescript file, which is your JavaScript functionality. With React, you basically have a JavaScript file, which contains your UI and the HTML, and then you have a CSS file that styles it. So in here is a very simple component. All it does is the H1 at the very top of the screen, and it comes back. The form, if we look at it right here, it has, when you look down here at the bottom, you have the input and the button that is being used to display it. And then you have information that's being passed into it. And then when you click on the buttons, these are the commands that are being executed. And those commands I showed you earlier in the app.js file. So, all right, so I'm going to talk about Vue, and I'm slowly running out of time, so I'm going to move along pretty quickly going through Vue. It's the newest one of the three. It was released in February 2014. It was created by an ex-Google employee that he created it. It's not backed by a major company, unlike Angular and React, which are backed by Google and Facebook. It does have a core set of developers that do work with Vue, but their only support is through Patreon, which if you've ever seen Patreon, it's a way that you can actually give back to people that are writing open source software and provide payment to them for their contributions to the open source network. As a result of having such a small development team, your versions come out whenever they come out. There isn't a regular schedule. It's not on an annual basis. It's not every 6 months. It's whenever they have something ready, they release those updates for you. Excuse me. It's a framework. So like Angular, it is a framework. It doesn't provide all the functionality that Angular would have in terms of a framework. When you're using it, it's just like React. It provides just the V part of the MVC in the application. Just like React, it's agnostic to your data letter because they're only concerned with the view part. So whatever you want to use for your model on the back end, it doesn't matter to them. They also use a virtual DOM like React, and they use JSX also. In terms of functionality, when you're using Vue, templates, data binding expressions, and directives are things that you need to know when you're actually learning Vue itself. The pros and cons of Vue compared to the other ones is it's very easy to understand and to develop with it. So of the three between Angular, React, and Vue, Angular is clearly going to have the longest learning curve in being able to use it. React does have a learning curve, but it's not as great as Angular. Vue, on the other hand, literally is something that if you know HTML and CSS, you can watch a short video or read a couple of articles about how to get up and running with Vue, and you can start using it. When I learned Vue, it was a Saturday morning, I had to get new brakes put on my car. I went to the body shop, at 8 a.m. to put my car in the shop, and I sat down on their sofa in the waiting room, and I pulled out my computer and I watched somebody's video on Vue, and was taking notes as I was watching the video and everything else like that. And then I read somebody's, how to do a quick application on Vue on an article written on Medium. And before I had my breaks finished, I was able to go out and create my very first application on Vue. You would never have been able to do that in Angular or React on my side. The other thing that it has in terms of a pro is its small size. It's the smallest of the three. Angular is clearly the biggest, React is medium size, and Vue is a small size. And because of that, it's just fast. It's probably one of the fastest ones that you have out there. You can easily take Vue and use it in other applications that you're using today, which is one of the selling points about it. The other one that it uses templates. Remember when we talked about React, you're writing your UI within the JavaScript itself, so you're using it within JSX, which is a new concept for JavaScript programmers to learn and to understand. With Vue, you're using templates. So if you have somebody on your development team that knows HTML and CSS and maybe a little bit of JavaScript, it's very easy for them to pick up and just start using Vue and being able to provide access to it. In terms of the cons on using Vue, you're not probably going to be able to scale up a Vue application to use it on the level of the major players that I showed that were using Angular and React today. The other con on it is that it has a very small ecosystem and it has no support really for a mobile platform. Since it was developed by one guy, who is a Chinese-American guy, he wrote all of the source code in Chinese. So if we wanted to look at it, that's why there's, even though it's gaining a lot of traction, it's very difficult for English-speaking developers to contribute to something because we don't speak the language. So that's, kind of a trade-off. It's fast, it's easy to use, it has a lot of selling points to it. It's just that language barrier is going to be a stumbling block, I think, for it to grow and improve in terms of the ecosystem and all the things that are supported around it that are available to it. So, in terms of who uses it, Alibaba, Baidu, Expedia, Nintendo, GitLab, almost every one of the companies that are on there that are listed except for one are Asian-based companies. Because it's written in Chinese, it's developed by a Chinese American, it's much more popular in Asia than it is here in the US, even though it's considered in Stack Overflow's survey that just came out, it's considered one of the fastest growing frameworks that are out there, faster growing than Angular or React. But you're going to still have that problem of being able to use it because of that language barrier. So let's go back over and do a demonstration here. So when we come in here and we look at it, the Vue provides a CLI available to you just like Angular and React does. Does it to provide support for testing and whatnot. So let me close a bunch of these windows here. So when we come in and we look at the Vue configuration, what's right here, you have ESLint that's built into it from the command line. You've got your index.html, and when you look at it, it's very simple in what you have out. You have an HTML head, a body, and then the body has one thing in here, and that body has one thing that has an ID attached to it, and you're going to be using that ID to actually display the information itself. So when we come in and we look at a Vue template, before you had Angular, you had an HTML file, you had a CSS file, and you had a JavaScript file. So you had a separation of concerns. With React, you have a JavaScript file, and your UI is built into the JavaScript, and you had a CSS file. So you really have two things. With Vue, all of those three things are put into a single file, but it's broken up into three different sections. If you've ever done any development using Polymer, it's the exact same layout that they use with Polymer. And what you do is the three sections that are printed out in here is that you have the template, and this is your HTML code. So I have my H1 at the top. I have my to-dos where it provides out a list of all my to-dos, and then I have the form, which is my input and my button. So it's pretty much the exact same framework that we have for the other ones. Writing this is nothing more than straight HTML. If you know HTML, you can easily have created this. Then underneath that, you have your information that defines your Vue application. A Vue application goes out and you have a name that's assigned to it, you have a data that's assigned to it, and then you actually have the functions that are assigned to it also. Information for a Vue element is created using an EL, which is the link to the ID app that we have out there. And then at the very bottom, the third part of this file, you have your CSS. So everything's contained in one file. So when it takes components, it takes it to the extreme in that everything is in one file. So if you wanted to use this component in another application, it's a matter of just taking that file and copying it over into another application and being able to have access to it. So if we come in here and we look at our templates, our components that we have, The first one we have is our to-do. The exact same layout as what I showed you earlier. Broke it down into 3 parts. The first one is your UI. So here's the UI. It gives you your unordered list of all the items in your to-dos and displays all of them. Vue uses directives, and that's one of the things that you learn when you're using that. So it has these directives that are in here. Most of the directives are prefixed with V-, so it's easy to see where things are coming in. You can use a shorthand abbreviation of that directive by just using the colon on there. And then you can see here we have our class. You know, our class is basically being calculated for us. And then underneath that, you have your styles that are just styling out your HTML. And then you actually have your JavaScript code at the very bottom. So when you look at this right here, this to-do item, if I come over here and pull this back up, here's our view top item. Which one am I looking at? The to-dos. It's these 3 items because it's repeating all of the items that are out there to display. And then I have another component which is out there, which is my form, which is the input and the button to add it at the very bottom. So going back through and looking at that, let me get this going back again, is if you wanted to summarize the difference between them, between all 3 of them, all 3 of them have a CLI, allows you to scaffold out an application to be able to use it. Angular CLI is much more detailed. It provides much more functionality available to you. In terms of frameworks and library, Angular and Vue are both frameworks. React is a library. Angular is going to be the most opinionated. In terms of size, Angular is going to be the largest, React is the next smallest, and Vue is clearly the smallest between the 2. In terms of learning curve, Angular is going to have the longest learning curve, React is going to be next, Vue is going to be the easiest one to be able to learn on that. If you have like junior developers, it's very easy for them to pick up and be able to start using Vue. In terms of support, Angular and React are backed by major companies. Vue, not really. I mean, like I said, they do have about a dozen core developers that work on it. Trade-off on it is that all the source code is written in Chinese, so that creates some little hiccups in terms of being able to have access to it. All right, so basically I talked about all the different guidelines that are available to you. Additional resources that are available to you if you want to look at. I have a website out there called codeprep.io. If you're looking to interview for a developer position, it has actual interview questions that have been asked on topics like HTML, CSS, JavaScript, jQuery, general questions out there so that you can look at that and go through them. My YouTube channel also has a series of videos that I've created on how to ace the whiteboard exercise that you have. In5days.tech is another website that I just put up beginning of this year. It provides email training, not in-depth training, but gives you an overview of technology. Right now I have 2 out on Webpack and NPM as a build tool, so basically they're both talking about tooling. You sign up, just put your email in, and for 5 days in a row, you'll be getting an email that tells you about how to learn about Webpack or NPM. By this weekend, I should have some more in here. So, next, since y'all been thinking about it, I can see it in your eyes, y'all been thinking about this the whole presentation. So of these 4 things, which one do you think is not true? So the first one, how many people think that I did not ask Prince Charles for his autograph at a UGA football game? Okay, you people are wrong. Who thinks I did not attend Prince Philip's birthday party at Edinburgh Castle? Okay, you people are wrong too. The third one, I attended Easter Mass at Windsor Castle with Queen Elizabeth. That is true. we were in England and we heard that they were having Easter Mass, and so we were on vacation. And normally you don't have an Easter dress with you when you're traveling on vacation, so we put together as best we could, and we showed up at Windsor Castle, and they had the ropes lined up and the guards out and everything else like that, and everybody was taking pictures, and we walked right up to the guy that was standing on the other side of the roped off things and says, "Excuse me, sir, but we're supposed to be inside." And he just kind of like looked at us, and we were dressed, I guess, good enough. He was like, "Oh yes, madam," and he put stuff, and we walked in, and people started taking pictures of us. It was great. The last one is, I did not attend St. John's College, so that is the one thing that is not true. So here's my last slide. If you didn't get a picture of it earlier, you can. It's a way for you to reach out and have access to me. I appreciate it very much. You've got 4 minutes to make it to